Why was the range so quiet when she spoke? Why did 8 of the most elite men in uniform suddenly fall silent because of a single sentence from her lips? Sarah Martinez hadn't meant to say it. She hadn't planned the words. They escaped her the way a nervous exhale does when the body been holding too much in for too long. One moment, she was just another range worker in a faded polo shirt, carrying cardboard silhouettes to the 500-yard line. The next, she had done something dangerous, something reckless. She had corrected a Navy SEAL in front of his team. The rifle's fine. You're pulling your shots left because you're anticipating recoil. That was it, 9 words. But in the hush that followed, Sarah felt like the world had stopped. She could feel the weight of 8 pairs of eyes behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know. Every breath, every heartbeat, every small sound seemed. The seagulls overhead, the distant waves crashing against the cliffs, even the slow, rasping inhale of the man she had just corrected. He was the youngest of the group, still raw around the edges. His pride had been bleeding out with every missed shot, every taunt from his teammates. He'd finally thrown down his rifle in frustration, cursed it as faulty, and that's when Sarah had opened her mouth. She couldn't help it. Watching bad form was one thing, but blaming the weapon, no, that was something her father would never allow. And Sarah was still her father's daughter. She stood there, frozen, target frame in her hands, heart hammering so hard she thought the men could hear it. She should have walked away. She should have stayed invisible, like she always did when military groups rented the range. But the silence had already stretched too long, and now she had no way back. She set down the target frame slowly, almost reverently, as if buying herself a few seconds before she had to face them. When she finally turned, it was worse than she imagined. The team was staring, with his jaw clenched in anger, the others with something closer to amusement, curiosity, or maybe even annoyance. And then there was the man who mattered most, Jake, their leader. He wasn't the tallest, wasn't the loudest, but Sarah had watched him long enough to know. His men followed his cues, his nods, his silences. He was the kind of man who didn't need to announce authority. He wore it like a second skin. And his eyes were fixed on her now, sharp, assessing. "You think you can do better?" His voice carried across the firing line, even and unhurried, but edged with something that made Sarah's stomach twist. It wasn't anger, it wasn't mockery, it was curiosity, and that was somehow worse. Scoffed loudly, muttering something under his breath about college kids who change targets. But Jake's hand cut him off mid-sentence. The range fell silent again. Sarah swallowed. She could walk away, pretend she hadn't heard, shrug it off with an apology. But her father's voice echoed in her head, as clear as if he were standing beside her. Never make a claim you can't back up. Never challenge unless you're ready to prove it. Her mouth was dry, her palms damp, but she nodded. Jake bent, lifted the rifle had thrown down, and checked the chamber with practiced ease. Then he walked it over to her. The matte black weapon felt heavier than she expected when he placed it in her hands. This wasn't her father's hunting rifle. It wasn't a weekend plinking session at the county range. This was military steel, precision optics, and the ghost of war clinging to every scratch on the receiver. "You hit the target has been missing all morning. I'll buy lunch for everyone here." Jake's voice was level, almost casual, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "You miss, and you'll explain to my why a civilian was handling military weapons." The weight of the rifle was nothing compared to the weight of those words. Around her, the SEALs formed a loose semicircle, their conversation dead. Sarah could feel their stares pressing in. Smirk had returned, curling like smoke. He was certain she would fold, certain she'd crumble under the pressure. But Jake wasn't smirking, and it was the steadiness of his gaze that kept Sarah from breaking. She lowered herself onto the mat, the gravel biting through her jeans, and settled behind the rifle. The world shrank. The chatter, the ridicule, the judgment, it all fell away until it was just her, the weapon, and the target dancing in the heat shimmer 5 football fields away. She knew her body was trembling, but the tremor was familiar. It was the same one she had felt at 12 years old, the first time her father had placed a rifle in her hands. She had been small then, barely able to shoulder the weight. She had missed every shot, but her father hadn't cared. He had only watched her breathing, her finger on the trigger, her stubborn refusal to quit. "Shooting is like surgery," he had said softly that day. "Patience, precision, control your body under pressure, the shot will come." And that memory steadied her now. She adjusted her body, correcting the mistakes she had seen make. Elbows angled just right, cheek pressed firmly against the stock, breathing even, pulse slowing. Her father's voice again: "Master yourself first, then worry about the weapon." "Before I shoot," Sarah said, surprising herself with the calm in her voice, "let me show you what was doing wrong." Made a noise of protest, but Jake's look silenced him. Sarah demonstrated quickly: weight shifted wrong, grip too tight, cheek weld inconsistent. She explained each error the way her father had explained fundamentals to her, simply, clearly, without ego. For a moment she forgot the SEALs were watching. She was just teaching. And then Jake said, "Now show us the right way." The world slowed. Sarah's breathing evened. She exhaled halfway, held, and let her finger press the trigger straight back, smooth and unhurried. The rifle cracked, the recoil pushed into her shoulder, and through the scope she saw the puff of dust bloom exactly where she'd aimed. She didn't lift her head, didn't let the moment break. She chambered another round, squeezed again. Another impact. Then a third. 3 shots. 3 perfect holes in the steel silhouette, clustered so close together they looked like one. When she finally lifted her head, the silence was deafening. Jake lowered his spotting scope slowly, his expression unreadable. Then finally, 3 shots, 2-inch group, dead center. The words hit harder than the recoil. Sarah's chest tightened. For a moment she thought she might laugh or cry or both. His face was pale, the smirk gone. He muttered something: "That's impossible," but the conviction was gone too. It wasn't impossible, it was real. And in that silence, as the SEAL team processed what they had just seen, Sarah realized something she hadn't let herself believe until now. She wasn't just a range employee. She wasn't just a nursing student working part-time. She was Martinez's daughter. She had inherited more than her father's stubbornness. She had inherited his patience, his precision, his quiet mastery. Jake's voice cut through her thoughts. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah looked at the rifle in her hands, at the target downrange, at the faces of men who had doubted her minutes ago. And she thought of the weekends spent in the California sun with her father, his injured leg propped on a stool, his voice patient, unwavering, teaching her the fundamentals. "From the best teacher I ever had," she whispered. The others didn't speak, but in their silence she could feel the balance shift. Something had changed, something small but undeniable. For the first time in her life, Sarah Martinez wasn't invisible. And that terrified her more than anything. What happens after silence? What do you do when the moment that should end everything is the one that begins something else? Sarah Martinez didn't move at first. The rifle still lay in her hands, heavier now, as if aware of the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. 3 perfect shots, a cluster so clean even the steel target seemed to acknowledge her in stunned silence. She had meant only to prove a point, to show what he had been doing wrong. But the point had grown into something larger, something she hadn't asked for and wasn't sure she wanted. Stared at the target, his confidence shattered, muttering fragments of denial. "Nobody shoots like that, not on the first try, not with a rifle like this." His voice was thin, brittle. But Jake was not. It wasn't her first try. He said it softly, almost to himself, but the words carried like an order across the firing line. His eyes never left Sarah's face. And there, in that look, she saw something shift: curiosity, calculation, and something close to respect. The others began to murmur. The older SEAL with the gray at his temples spoke first. "Gunny Martinez's kid." His tone carried recognition and a kind of reverence Sarah hadn't expected. I knew the name sounded familiar. Sarah froze. You knew my father. Not personally, but his reputation. Everybody knew about Martinez. Scout Sniper School, legendary. His voice softened. He trained Marines who swore he could take a recruit who'd never held a rifle and turn him into a marksman in weeks. Sarah's chest tightened. Pride, yes, but also fear. Because now it wasn't just her skills they were weighing, it was her father's legacy. And then Jake asked the question she had been dreading. So, why are you working at a range instead of competing professionally? Her lips parted, but the truth caught in her throat. Because I'm scared. Because shooting was never supposed to be my life. Because I thought I was just paying tuition, not carrying his name. What she managed instead was smaller, safer. I'm in nursing school. This is just a part-time job. The answer sounded weak to her own ears, but Jake didn't press. His eyes were unreadable as he studied her, the way a man might study a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Then a low engine rumble cut through the tension. A black sedan rolled up to the range office. The seals straightened almost instinctively, the kind of reflex that comes from hierarchy, discipline, rank. A man stepped out, navy dress blues, authority in every line of his posture, Commander Harrison. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She was still holding the rifle, still kneeling on the gravel, still the focus of too many eyes. And now another set and officers was joining them. Jake was the first to speak. Sir. His tone was formal but not stiff. Training, progressing well. We've had some unexpected assistance. The commander's gaze followed his hand, settling on Sarah. The weight of it was crushing. And who is this? Harrison asked. Sarah Martinez, Jake replied smoothly. Her father is Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, former Scout Sniper School instructor. Recognition flickered across the commander's face. Martinez, I remember that name. His eyes shifted back to Sarah. And what sort of assistance have you been providing, Miss Martinez? Sarah wanted to disappear. She wanted to fold back into invisibility, to be just the girl who replaced targets and swept brass. But Jake didn't let her retreat. She identified flaws in form, Jake explained, corrected them, then demonstrated with a 3-shot group that meets advanced marksmanship standards. The commander studied her, long, careful. Is that so? Sarah's throat felt tight. She managed, yes, sir, but it was just observation. I didn't. Recreationally, Harrison's eyebrow arched. That wasn't recreational shooting. That was precision marksmanship, better than half the men I've seen compete. The words didn't feel real. Sarah glanced down at the rifle in her lap, her hands still trembling faintly. She remembered nights of poring over anatomy textbooks until her eyes blurred. She remembered counting tips from her range paycheck to cover another semester's tuition. She remembered her father's slow, careful way of teaching. No fanfare, no applause. And now a Navy commander was telling her she had talent worth more than her nursing degree. She didn't know whether to feel proud or guilty. Jake's voice broke the silence. With your permission, sir, I'd like to invite Miss Martinez to observe some of our advanced sessions. She's demonstrated the ability to diagnose issues quickly. It could be valuable. Sarah's breath caught. Observe training with Navy SEALs. This was more than unexpected. This was impossible. She was just a student, just a daughter, just. But the commander was nodding. If she's willing. His eyes returned to her, steady, almost kind. Miss Martinez. Sarah's mind raced. She could say no. She could retreat back to safety, back to obscurity, back to the comfortable rhythm of targets and textbooks. But her father's voice rose again in her memory. When opportunity knocks, you'd better be ready to answer the door. Her lips parted, and before her fear could stop them, the words came. Yes, sir, I'd be honored. The commander's expression softened just slightly, then it settled. And just like that, her life bent on a hinge she hadn't seen coming. As Harrison walked away, the SEALs still stood silent, gave her a faint nod of respect, avoided her eyes. Jake just watched, his expression unreadable, as if weighing the cost of what had just happened. Sarah laid the rifle down gently, almost reluctantly, and stood. Her legs felt unsteady, like she had been running, though she hadn't moved at all. The breeze off the ocean cooled her face, but inside she was burning with adrenaline. It had been a simple morning, just another shift at the range. Replace targets, collect brass, stay invisible, that was the job. But now she had stepped into a place she didn't belong, or maybe a place she was always meant to be. She couldn't tell yet. All she knew was this: she wasn't invisible anymore. And sometimes that was the scariest thing of all. What do you do when the door opens wider than you ever imagined? When the chance you never asked for stares back, daring you to step through? Sarah had barely slept the night after Commander Harrison's offer. She'd lain in bed staring at the ceiling, her nursing textbooks open but unread, her hands still remembering the cold steel of the SEAL's rifle. Every replay of that moment, her 3 perfect shots, felt like a dream she couldn't wake from. But the promise had been real. An invitation. Observe their advanced training sessions. By morning, the weight of it pressed harder. Who was she to stand among them? She wasn't military. She wasn't trained. She was just the girl who taped cardboard targets to stands and swept brass into bins. What business did she have observing warriors who lived on the knife's edge of life and death? Still, when Jake called the range office that afternoon, arrangements already made with her supervisor, Sarah heard herself say the words she hadn't believed possible. "Yes, I'll come." The first session unsettled her before it even began. 2 black SUVs pulled into the range, doors opening in unison, men moving with a synchronicity she could never match. They carried themselves like shadows, efficient, deliberate, untouchable. Sarah lingered at the edge, clutching a notebook she wasn't sure she'd need. Jake spotted her first. He gave no smile, no nod, just a simple gesture: "Come closer." The others followed his lead, acknowledging her without ceremony, without fanfare. She wasn't one of them, but she was here. They began with drills Sarah had never seen up close. Multiple shooters working in rotation, adjusting for shifting winds, working through malfunctions with seamless precision. Each motion was fluid, practiced, honed by repetition under pressure. Watching them, Sarah felt small, like a child eavesdropping on a language she couldn't understand. But then she saw it. One of the shooters was back on the line. His posture was now more disciplined after their first encounter, but Sarah's eyes caught what others missed: a subtle hitch in his trigger pull, a fraction of hesitation born of doubt. His rounds were landing better than before, but still drifting, and no one else seemed to notice. Her hands itched to write it down, to capture the mistake before it slipped away. She glanced at Jake. He was watching too, expression unreadable. Did he see it, or was he waiting to see if she would? Sarah's breath caught. She wasn't here to interfere. She wasn't here to instruct. She was only supposed to observe. But her father's words whispered again: "If you see the truth and stay silent, you're part of the mistake." She leaned slightly toward Jake, her voice low. "He's anticipating again. It's small, but every shot pulls just a hair left at the break." Jake's head turned slowly. His eyes studied her, then returned to the shooter. A pause. Then he called for a halt. "Check your press." The younger SEAL stiffened, adjusted. His next round landed dead center. Sarah's heart raced. She had spoken, she had been heard. But the silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Later, when the drill ended and the men refilled their magazines, Jake spoke quietly beside her. "You saw that before I did." Sarah shook her head. "No, I just—" "You did," he cut her off gently. "Not praise, not flattery, just fact." And that was somehow harder to accept. The next sessions grew heavier with expectation. Sarah found herself analyzing instinctively, cataloging patterns the way she had with civilian shooters. The way his shoulders rose when he was pushing past fatigue. The way his confidence frayed when others mocked him. The way even Jake, steady and precise, sometimes let his focus linger too long on his team instead of his own breathing. But speaking up never came easy. Each time she wrestled with the fear of overstepping. Each time she remembered her father's insistence on truth. And each time she did speak, Jake's nod was subtle but real. Yet doubt clung like a shadow. After one session, Sarah drove home with the windows down, the ocean wind whipping through her hair. Her notebook lay open on the passenger seat, filled with scrawled notes about form, wind, pressure points, mistakes. She should have felt proud. Instead, she felt something closer to shame. Because who was she to correct them? They had bled for their nation. They had faced fire she couldn't imagine. And she was still just a student who had never heard the sound of real combat. That night, she called her father. Martinez rasped through the phone, his voice worn from years of pain but steady as ever. "What's weighing on you?" She told him everything. The shots, the SEALs, the commander, the sessions. The way her voice kept catching between silence and speaking. When she finished, there was a long pause. Then her father chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that carried more sorrow than mirth. "You think you don't belong, but listen to me carefully. You see things they don't. That's not arrogance. That's not disrespect. That's your gift." "But Dad," she whispered, "they've lived it. I haven't. I'm nothing compared to them." "You're my daughter," he said simply. "That's not nothing." The words sank deeper than she wanted them to. Days later, she found herself on the edge of another session, this one with Marine Scout snipers. Hardened men, skeptical eyes, the air thick with challenge. Sarah stayed silent longer than usual, her nerves raw under their judgment. But then she saw it again. A shot drifting, not from trigger pull, not from form, but from something else. A subtle wind pattern along the, bending just enough to throw rounds off course. The flags didn't show it, but her eyes did. She hesitated, her chest tightened, and then, remembering her father's voice, she spoke. At first the Marines frowned, but when they adjusted as she suggested, the results shifted instantly. Shot after shot fell into place, accuracy restored. The air changed, doubt turned to something else. Attention, respect. Commander Harrison had been watching from behind. Later, he pulled her aside. His words were quiet, deliberate. "Miss Martinez, you're wasted on target duty. You have something rare, not just skill, vision, the ability to see what others miss. Have you thought about making this a career?" The question rattled her. Nursing had always been the plan. Safe, predictable, healing instead of breaking. But Harrison's eyes told her this wasn't just flattery, it was possibility. That night, Sarah sat in her car overlooking the ocean. The waves pounded the cliffs, steady, relentless, eternal. Her notebook lay open in her lap, pages filled with truths she hadn't meant to collect. Her hands shook as she wrote one final line. "Maybe I was wrong about who I am." She closed the book, shut her eyes, and let the wind carry her doubts into the night. How do you know when something small has turned into something life-changing? Is it sudden, like a switch flipped, or gradual, creeping in so quietly you don't realize it until the old life feels like a stranger? For Sarah Martinez, it was both. Weeks after Commander Harrison's question, she still carried it with her. It slipped into her mind during lectures on anatomy, during late-night study sessions, even when she pulled into the range parking lot before dawn. Have you thought about making this a career? Career. The word tasted foreign, heavy, almost dangerous. Nursing was supposed to be the career. It was what she told everyone. It was what she had promised herself. Her father's disability check covered the basics, but her job at the range kept them afloat. Nursing was her way to build something solid, safe. And yet here she was, spending her mornings on firing lines with men who tested themselves against impossibility. Writing in notebooks that filled faster than her textbooks ever did. Observing, correcting, learning. She felt herself pulled toward it like a tide. The break came in the most unexpected way. She was finishing up another long day at the range when Jake approached. He stood quiet, watching her stack targets back into storage. Finally, he spoke. "There's someone you should meet." The name meant nothing at first. Former Army officer, now head of a private contractor that specialized in advanced marksmanship training. "She heard about you," Jake said simply, "and she's interested." Sarah froze. Interested in what? "In hearing you." The words landed like a rifle crack. Sarah almost laughed. She was a student, not a soldier. She was still learning, not teaching, but Jake wasn't smiling. "Talk to her," he said. "That's all I'm asking." The meeting was held in a small, unassuming office off base. Was what Sarah expected. She wasn't intimidating, not in the way commanders or instructors were. Her presence was quieter, steadier, her eyes sharp with curiosity rather than judgment. "I've heard about you," began, her voice measured. "Not just the shots, the way you read people, the way you explain things, that's what I'm interested in." Sarah shifted uneasily. "I'm not military, I'm not even finished with school, I don't think." "That's exactly why," interrupted. "Most of our instructors are military snipers, excellent shooters, but sometimes," she leaned back, studying Sarah carefully, "sometimes they can't translate that knowledge to people outside their world. You can. You've been watching from the ground up. You see differently. That's rare." Sarah didn't know what to say. The offer came next. Not just observation, not just a volunteer role, a job, real pay triple what she earned at the range, flexible hours that could bend around her nursing schedule, opportunities to travel. But it wasn't the money that caught Sarah. It was the last thing said, her voice soft but certain. "We're not just hearing another instructor. We're looking for someone who can change how we teach, someone who thinks differently, someone who sees." The words lingered long after the meeting ended. That night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table across from her father, bills stacked neatly between them, her textbooks pushed aside. She told him everything. The offer, the doubts, the fear that saying yes meant betraying the plan she'd been clinging to for years. Martinez listened quietly. His hands, and stiff, rested flat against the table. When she finished, he asked only one question. "Do you remember what I used to tell you, back when you first started shooting?" She nodded slowly. "Shooting is like surgery, patience, precision, control under pressure." Her father's eyes softened. "And I told you something else. That teaching is harder than doing, because teaching means you understand why. You don't just hit the target, you help others hit it. That's a gift, and gifts aren't meant to be wasted." Sarah's throat tightened. "But nursing is honorable," he finished for her, "and you'll always have it, but this," he tapped the table lightly, "this is rare. If you walk away, will you regret it?" She didn't answer, she couldn't. The silence stretched, heavy and fragile. Her father leaned back, wincing slightly at the pain in his leg. "Opportunities like this don't come twice. Think carefully." She thought for days. She carried the decision like a weight through every class, every shift. And when the call finally came from, asking if she'd made up her mind, Sarah's voice shook as she answered. "Yes, I'll do it." Her first assignment arrived weeks later. A training facility in Virginia. A week-long course for a mix of law enforcement snipers and seasoned Marines. Traveled with her, guiding her through logistics, introducing her to the equipment she'd never used before. Sarah was grateful for the mentorship, but terrified of the reality. The first day was brutal. Skeptical faces greeted her as she stood at the front of the class. Some wore uniforms, some wore badges, but the expression was the same. "Who are you, and why should we listen?" Her voice faltered at first. She clutched her notes too tightly, her explanations landing stiff and fragile. Several Marines exchanged smirks. One of them whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "She's just a civilian." Her cheeks burned. She wanted to run. But then she remembered the range. She remembered smirk. And she remembered how silence had turned to awe when she pulled the trigger. She took a breath, put down her notes, and spoke instead from memory, from what she had seen, what she had learned, what she understood. Textbooks tell you the right way to shoot, she said softly, but your body isn't a textbook. Every shoulder is different. Every heartbeat is different. You can't force yourself into someone else's mold. You have to understand your own mechanics, and then make the rifle part of you. The room quieted. The skepticism didn't vanish, not at once, but as the week went on, something shifted. Sarah walked the line, adjusting shoulders, correcting grips, explaining breathing. She caught mistakes others hadn't seen. She offered solutions that worked instantly, and slowly, resistance melted into something else. By the fourth day, even the loudest skeptic, the Marine who'd called her a civilian, was looking at her differently. He had struggled with a challenging shot all morning. Frustration carved deep lines in his face. Sarah approached, spoke quietly, suggested an adjustment no one else had offered. He tried it. His next shot landed perfect. He lowered his rifle, stunned, then looked at her not with doubt, but with respect. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. She thought of her father, of weekends at the range, his patient voice guiding her, of every mistake she had cataloged, every correction she had carried silently. From watching, from listening, from trying to understand why things work. The Marine studied her, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. That night Sarah wrote in her notebook. Her words were shaky but certain. "They doubted me at first, but teaching isn't about proving myself. It's about helping them see. And maybe this is who I was meant to be." When the week ended, pulled her aside. "You did more than teach. You shifted perspectives. That's what I hired you for." Sarah drove home exhausted but alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Nursing still mattered. But this was something deeper, something she hadn't chosen but maybe had been chosen for. She parked by the ocean that night, watching the waves pound the cliffs, endless, relentless. The air smelled of salt and possibility. She thought of her father. She thought of Jake. She thought of all the doors opening, one after another, daring her to step through. And for the first time, she whispered to herself the truth she had been afraid to admit. Maybe I'm not just filling targets. Maybe I'm filling something bigger. What happens when the world begins to take you seriously, yet you still can't bring yourself to believe it? For Sarah Martinez, the weeks after Virginia felt like living in two different realities. By day, she was still the nursing student hunched over textbooks, memorizing anatomy charts, cramming for exams in crowded classrooms. By night, and often by weekend, she was standing on firing lines with men whose faces carried the weight of battle, correcting grips, reading winds, showing them truths they hadn't seen. The contrast was jarring. One world demanded empathy, healing, a steady hand in the quiet of hospital halls. The other demanded sharp eyes, analysis, precision under pressure. She tried to tell herself she could do both, but deep down, she knew the balance was fragile. Her assignments grew more intense. Word spread quickly through the small, close-knit circles of military and law enforcement training. The range girl who could read wind patterns, who could diagnose mistakes in seconds, who could explain fundamentals in ways even seasoned shooters understood. She was in demand. Worked carefully, shielding Sarah from the noise, managing expectations, but also pushing her when it mattered. "You're not here to impress them," told her before one course. "You're here to help them. Remember that. Respect follows results." The first real test came with a mixed group, Army Rangers on one side, FBI hostage rescue snipers on the other. Veterans with years of training, medals tucked away, confidence running high. Sarah walked into the room and felt their eyes immediately. Assessing, dismissing. The whispers weren't subtle. "She's a contractor, she's just a kid, what's she gonna teach us?" Her chest tightened. Doubt clawed at her ribs. She wanted to shrink, to let step in, to fade into the background. But didn't move. She only gave Sarah a small nod, firm, steady. "Your turn." So Sarah stepped forward. Her voice cracked once, but she kept going. You've all been trained by the best. You've all hit impossible shots. I'm not here to take that from you. I'm here to give you something different, to show you why some of the shots you miss aren't because of you, but because of the way the environment lies to you. The room shifted ever so slightly. Not belief, not yet, but curiosity. She led them outside into the biting wind of the open range. She watched them settle into prone positions, adjusting scopes, dialing dope charts. Their shots cracked in rhythm, targets ringing. Good shooting, professional. But Sarah's eyes weren't on the steel. They were on the trees lining the ridge, the faint shimmer where warm air collided with cold, the grass bending unevenly. "You're fighting two winds," she said quietly. "One you can see in the flags, the other's hidden in the terrain." Some ignored her, others smirked. But one ranger, frustrated after missing 3 shots, listened. He adjusted the way she suggested. His next round landed center. His eyes widened. By the end of the day, others followed. Curiosity turned to testing. Testing turned to trust. And trust turned to respect. It wasn't instant. It never was. But Sarah had learned something critical. Respect didn't come from titles or age or even medals. It came from results. Still, the doubts didn't vanish. That night in the hotel room, Sarah stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her hands smelled faintly of gun oil. Her notebook was crammed with new observations. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she whispered the question she hadn't dared say aloud. Am I betraying the person I thought I was supposed to be? She was supposed to be a nurse, to heal, to save. Her father had raised her with discipline, but also with compassion. And now she was spending more time teaching others to take cleaner shots than she was studying for the next exam. The war inside her grew louder. Back home, her classmates didn't understand. "You're teaching military guys how to shoot," one asked, incredulous. "That's so random," another laughed. "What's next? You dropping out to become a sniper?" Sarah forced a smile. She told them it was just part-time work, just a way to pay tuition. But the lie stung every time. Her father noticed the change before anyone else. "Your eyes are different," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch. His cane leaned against the chair, his gaze steady. "Different how?" she asked. "Not tired," he said. "Focused, like you're seeing further than before." Sarah swallowed. "Dad, what if I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore?" Martinez reached over, resting his hand gently on hers. "None of us ever know. You think I plan to get injured, to leave the Corps early. Life decides for you sometimes. All you can do is choose not to waste the gifts you're given." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to silence the guilt gnawing at her every time she walked into a hospital classroom and felt lichen. But the truth was, her heart beat faster on the range than it ever did in the lecture hall. Months passed. Sarah taught more courses. Rangers, Marines, police snipers. She adapted quickly, developing her own methods. Less rigid than military instruction, more analytical, focused on why. It worked. Students listened, adjusted, improved. But each success only deepened her inner conflict. One evening, during a long drive back from a course, Sarah pulled off at a rest stop. She sat in her car, headlights off, staring into the dark. She thought of the students she had helped, men who would go back into cities, into combat, into hostage situations. Men whose shots might one day mean life or death. And she thought of the patients she hadn't treated yet, the hospital floors she hadn't walked, the lives she thought she was supposed to save. Was she choosing the wrong life? Her notebook lay open on the passenger seat. Scribbled observations filled the pages. In the margins, she had written something days earlier, almost without thinking. Sometimes saving lives doesn't look like healing. Sometimes it looks like helping others do their jobs better. She closed the notebook, her hands trembling. She wasn't ready to give herself an answer, not yet. But deep down, she knew the question wasn't going away. What happens when the people who doubt you aren't rookies anymore, but the ones who already seen everything? Sarah thought she had grown used to skepticism. She thought she'd learned to live with the weight of doubt, to wait for her results to speak louder than her name. But nothing prepared her for the course in Nevada. It wasn't the desert heat that unsettled her, though it pressed heavy, dry, relentless. It wasn't the long hours, though they stretched past exhaustion. It was the faces of the men waiting for her, veterans, combat-seasoned, snipers who had already done the impossible under fire. They weren't curious like the Rangers had been. They weren't defensive like had been. They were worse. They were indifferent. One Marine leaned back on his elbows as she was introduced, his sunglasses reflecting the glare. "She's teaching us," he muttered. "Hell, I've got shirts older than she is." The others chuckled. No malice, just certainty, certainty that she didn't belong. Sarah forced herself to stand tall, notebook in hand, had warned her. "They'll test you harder than anyone else, but remember, you don't need to beat them, you just need to help them." Still, her throat tightened. Her father's words whispered at the back of her mind, "Master yourself first." The first 2 days were brutal. Every suggestion she gave was met with questions, every correction with raised brows. When a shot drifted, the shooter shrugged as if to say, "That happens sometimes," refusing to acknowledge her input. Sarah went back to her motel at night exhausted, lying on the bed with her notes scattered across the sheets, staring at the ceiling fan as if it might spin answers out of the air. Her textbook sat unopened in the corner of her bag. Nursing exams were only weeks away, but she hadn't touched them, and guilt pressed hard. "What if they're right?" she whispered into the dark. "What if I don't belong here?" The third day cracked everything open. It was late afternoon, the desert sun dropping low, casting long shadows across the range. The veterans had been working on long-distance drills, 3/4-mile shots across shifting winds. The targets were battered steel, edges gleaming where rounds had struck. One shooter, a grizzled Marine named Torres, had been missing all day. His frustration burned hotter than the Nevada heat. He cursed, adjusted, fired again, missed again. The others laughed quietly. Not at him, but near him, the way soldiers do when covering their own nerves. Sarah watched him. Something didn't sit right. It wasn't his form, wasn't his trigger pull. It was the environment. She noticed the dust devils spinning faintly off to the left, the heat shimmer rising heavier near the ridge. A secondary wind current, subtle, invisible unless you knew how to look. Her mouth went dry. She could speak. Or she could stay silent. If she was wrong, they'd laugh her off the range. If she was right. Her father's voice again. "If you see the truth and stay silent, you're part of the mistake." "Wait," she said suddenly, her voice cut sharper than she intended. The laughter stilled. Torres glanced back, irritated. "What?" Sarah swallowed. "You're reading the wrong wind. The flags are showing one direction, but look at the dust devils. Look at the shimmer on the ridge. There's a crosswind cutting at 4 o'clock. That's what's pushing you off." The silence was heavier than the heat. Torres squinted, skeptical. Then grudgingly he adjusted. His next shot cracked. The steel rang loud, dead center. The others sat up. Torres lowered his rifle slowly, eyes narrowing, not in anger this time, but in thought. Sarah's pulse thundered. She hadn't breathed. Now the air came rushing back into her lungs. "Do it again," another Marine called out. Torres fired again. Hit, adjusted slightly, hit again. The murmurs rose, low, surprised. Respect had not yet come, but something had shifted. By evening, when the session ended, Torres approached her quietly. He stood close, hands resting on his belt, voice low enough that only she could hear. "You were right, I didn't see it. Nobody did. Where'd you learn to read like that?" Sarah hesitated. The answer was simple. "My father. We used to shoot in places where the wind never told the truth." Torres studied her, then gave a single small nod. "Fair enough." It was more than she expected. But the real test came the next day. The group had been assigned a timed challenge, 10 rounds at varying distances, shifting conditions, only one chance at each. Pressure high, fatigue higher. One by one, the veterans rotated through. Good shooting, mostly. A few misses. The heat bore down on them all. When it was Tor's turn again, he set up, dialed his scope, and began. The first few shots landed well, but halfway through his rhythm faltered. He rushed, missed, cursed under his breath. Sarah felt the tension spike. She could see it in his shoulders, in the way his jaw clenched, in the tremor of frustration that spread through his movements. She knew the pattern. She had seen it in months earlier. "Breathe," she whispered. She hadn't meant to say it loud enough for him to hear, but he did. His body stilled. He exhaled slowly, took the next shot, hit. Another hit. When he finished, his score outpaced the rest. And this time, the silence that followed was not skepticism. It was acknowledgement. That evening, in the cool dimness of the mess hall, one of the veterans raised his cup toward her. "To Martinez," he said simply. "Didn't think we'd learn from a civilian, but here we are." The others echoed the gesture, not rowdy, not mocking, just steady respect. Sarah sat frozen, the paper cup warm in her hand. Something inside her shifted again. She wasn't just tolerated anymore. She wasn't just the girl with good eyes. She was trusted. But trust brought new weight. Driving back to the motel that night, she felt the war inside her grow louder. She thought of the patients she was supposed to treat, the career she had promised herself, the quiet certainty of healing. And she thought of the rifles, the steel, the men whose lives depended on the truths she could see. Which was the greater responsibility? She pulled into the motel parking lot, cut the engine, and sat in the silence. Her notebook lay on the seat beside her, filled with scribbles, diagrams, observations. She opened it, flipping to the last page. She stared at the words she had written weeks ago, almost without thinking. "Maybe I was wrong about who I am." Tonight, she added another line beneath it, her hand trembling as the pen scratched across the paper. "Or maybe I'm still becoming her." She closed the book, leaned her head back against the seat, and let the desert quiet wash over her. The air was heavy with dust and possibility. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the weight anymore. What happens when you can no longer live two lives? When the paths you've been balancing suddenly pull so far apart that something has to break? Sarah Martinez had been trying for months. Nursing classes by day, training assignments by night, weekends on ranges with men whose lives carried scars she couldn't imagine. She told herself she could manage both, that the two halves of her life could coexist if she just pushed harder, studied longer, slept less. But the cracks were widening. It began with missed classes. At first, one or two, easily excused with vague explanations. Then more. Her professors noticed. The head nurse for her clinical rotation pulled her aside after she arrived late for the third time. "Sarah, you're one of my students," she said, eyes kind but firm. "But you're stretched thin. Medicine isn't forgiving. You can't half-step your way through this. Either you're here or you're not." The words stung because they were true, but Sarah swallowed them down, nodding, promising she'd do better. Then came the training assignment in North Carolina, a week-long program with federal agents preparing for hostage scenarios. Sarah had thought she could slip away, catch up on coursework when she returned. But halfway through the week, her phone buzzed with an email notification. Exam rescheduled. Earlier than expected. She would miss it. That night she sat in her hotel room, laptop open, heart pounding as she drafted an email to her professor. "Family emergency. Please, is there any way I can take the exam later?" The reply came cold. "We cannot accommodate repeated conflicts. This is your responsibility." Sarah closed the laptop, her vision blurred with tears she didn't let fall. She stepped outside into the humid night air, notebook in hand. She flipped through pages filled with scribbles, wind diagrams, notes on trigger press, sketches of body mechanics. She should have been reviewing anatomy terms, drug dosages, emergency procedures. Instead, she was staring at the language she had grown fluent in without meaning to. Her phone buzzed again. A text this time, Jake. How'd it go today? She hesitated before typing back. Good, they're starting to listen. His reply came fast. Of course they are. You're the real thing, Sarah. The words landed heavier than he could have known. The next morning, she stood on the range as agents lined up for a complex drill. The scenario was brutal: moving targets, timed shots, stress loaded by instructors shouting commands. The air was thick with tension. One shooter froze midway, his breathing spiraling out of control. Sarah saw it instantly, his hands trembling, his sight picture collapsing. She stepped in, voice calm, steady. Breathe, don't fight it, exhale, let the shot come. He followed, his next round hit, then another. By the end, he stood steadier. He looked at her with something like gratitude. Sarah felt it in her chest. The impact, the proof. She wasn't just teaching marksmanship. She was keeping these men alive for the moments that would come when paper targets turned into real lives. That night, though, as she sat in her car outside the motel, she thought of hospital patients she had yet to touch, of lives she might have healed had she been on the path she promised herself. Two worlds, both demanding everything, both refusing to wait. The breaking point came weeks later. Her nursing program held a mandatory clinical assessment, a simulation of emergency response in a crowded trauma ward. Sarah had prepared as much as she could, but her mind was split. The night before, she had flown back from Texas after training a group of SWAT snipers. She was running on 3 hours of sleep and too much coffee. The assessment began. A mannequin lay on the bed, vital signs displayed on monitors, instructors circling with clipboards. Sarah moved quickly, checking vitals, calling for equipment, issuing orders to her classmates. But halfway through, her hands faltered. She reached for the wrong medication vial. One of the instructors stopped her with a sharp voice. Careful, that mistake would kill a patient. Her heart sank. She finished the assessment, but she already knew she had failed. The report came later that day. Lack of focus, recommending probation until performance improves. Sarah sat in her car afterward, staring at the paper in her trembling hands. Words blurred. She thought of her father, of all the sacrifices she had made to get this far, of the future she had promised herself. But then she thought of the range, of the ringing steel, of the men who had walked away better because of what she saw, what she taught. Tears welled up, but she didn't let them fall. That night she called her father. "Dad," she whispered, "I think I've ruined everything." His voice came steady, even through the crackle of the phone line. "Tell me what happened." She told him everything. The exam, the probation, the training, the split inside her that felt like it was tearing her apart. When she finished, silence stretched on the line. Then Martinez spoke, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Sometimes the hardest truth is that you can't be two people at once. Nursing is noble. Shooting is noble too in its own way. But you can't serve both masters forever. You'll break." Sarah closed her eyes, tears finally falling. "But if I choose one, I'll lose the other. If I walk away from nursing, I let you down. If I walk away from this," she broke off, unable to finish. Her father's voice softened. "You'll never let me down. The only way you fail is if you lie to yourself about who you are." The words cut deeper than anything she'd heard. For days, Sarah carried them with her, into the hospital halls, onto the firing lines, into the sleepless nights when she stared at the ceiling, notebook open, textbooks untouched. The decision loomed, inevitable, unbearable. And then came the call. "Sarah, we've got a major course next month. FBI, HRT, Rangers, Marines. High profile. They asked for you by name." By name. Sarah gripped the phone, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." Silence was long. Then, "You already are." Sarah ended the call and sat in silence. Two paths, two futures, one choice. And for the first time, she realized she couldn't delay it any longer. What do you do when the moment you've been avoiding finally stands in front of you, refusing to let you pass without an answer? For Sarah Martinez, it came quietly, not in the crack of a rifle, not in the pressure of an exam, but in the stillness of her own heart. The weeks leading up to the FBI, Ranger, Marine Corps stretched her thin. Hospital shifts, study sessions, drills, training prep, it all blurred into one relentless storm. She tried to balance, tried to keep both worlds alive. But no matter how hard she pushed, something always slipped. Notes unread, lessons rushed, sleep stolen in fragments. She felt it breaking her down piece by piece. Until one morning, she woke before dawn, sat at her kitchen table with her textbooks on one side and her notebook on the other, and realized she couldn't touch either. Her hands just hovered, trembling, as if choosing one meant killing the other. Her father found her like that. He leaned on his cane, studied her for a long moment, and finally said, "It's time." She didn't argue, she didn't even ask what he meant. She already knew. The course began under gray skis, a mix of uniforms and quiet intensity, agents, Marines, Rangers, hardened, skeptical, professional. And there in the middle of them stood Sarah, not as a guest, not as an observer, but as an instructor asked for by name. She felt the weight of it. Every step she took down the firing line, every correction she gave, every glance she caught from men who had seen too much of war. But for the first time, she didn't let the weight crush her. She carried it. The drills were demanding, crosswinds, distance shifts, time pressure. The shooters sweated, cursed, adjusted. Sarah moved among them, her eyes sharp, her voice calm. She caught what others missed. She explained not with authority, but with clarity, with care. And slowly she watched the walls fall. By the third day, something remarkable happened. One of the Rangers, older, eyes hard as stone, finished a sequence and turned to her. Not the other instructors. Her. "What'd I miss?" Sarah told him. He nodded once, no hesitation, no resistance, just trust. By the final day, the course ended with a grueling scenario. Long-range targets, shifting winds, limited time. Lives simulated on the line. Sarah stood back, arms crossed, watching her students apply everything they had drilled. And when the last shot rang, when the final target fell, she saw it in their faces. Not just relief, not just pride, but belief. Belief that her presence had mattered. When the debrief ended, pulled her aside. "They'll talk about you," she said simply. "Word, already spreading further than you realize. And sooner or later, you'll have to decide if this is your life." That night, Sarah sat on the motel balcony, notebook in her lap, the air cool against her skin. She flipped back through the pages. Notes on shooting, notes on teaching, scribbles about winds, posture, breathing. And in the margins, her own quiet confessions. Maybe I was wrong about who I am, or maybe I'm still becoming her. She turned to the last page, empty, waiting. Her pen hovered. She thought of the hospital halls, the patients she would never treat, the life she had been building since she was a girl. She thought of the ranges, the steel ringing, the men and women who walked away sharper, steadier, alive because she had seen something they hadn't. She thought of her father, broken but unbowed, who had given her the gift of sight, the ability to see not just targets but truths. Her hand trembled, then steadied. And she wrote, "I am my father's daughter, but I am also my own. This is not about choosing one path over another. It is about becoming the person who doesn't waste what she's been given." The words bled onto the page like a promise. The next morning, she called her program director. Her voice shook, but she didn't falter. "I'm withdrawing. Nursing isn't where I'm meant to be." There was silence, then a polite response. She hung up, staring at her phone, breath unsteady but sure. Minutes later called. "So," she said lightly, though Sarah could hear the weight behind it, "are you ready to stop pretending this is part-time?" Sarah smiled through tears she hadn't expected. "Yes." And just like that, the decision was made. Not the end of one life, but the beginning of another. Months later, Sarah stood on a different range, somewhere far from home. The shooters were younger this time, eyes full of nerves. She watched them fumble with rifles too big for their shoulders, saw the same mistakes she had once whispered corrections to from the sidelines. She stepped forward, calm, steady, sure. "Breathing," she said softly. "Start there, the rest will follow." The students listened, and as the shots rang out, steady and clean, Sarah felt the quiet truth settle deep inside her chest. She hadn't betrayed her old dream. She hadn't abandoned it. She had simply discovered that healing doesn't always happen in hospitals. Sometimes it happens on ranges, in deserts, in forests, where one corrected trigger press, one centered shot, one moment of clarity can save a life before it's ever at risk. And maybe that was healing too. When she returned home, her father waited on the porch, Kane resting at his side. She handed him her notebook. He flipped through it slowly, page by page, his expression unreadable. When he reached the last line, he closed the book and looked up at her. His eyes glistened, though his voice stayed steady. "You found it." Sarah nodded. Her voice broke, but her words did not. "I think I did." They sat together in silence, the ocean wind rolling in, carrying with it the scent of salt and something new. And in that silence, Sarah understood the truth she had been running from. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. Sometimes it simply acts.